talk. A beautiful book, and these paintings are just wonderful. I will turn the sound up, Adam, but would you like to start?
Thank you. We'll see if this works, otherwise, can you hear me?
What?
The old-fashioned way. Well, this is about the revolution. I don't think they had microphones back then. Thank you very much for coming. It is a beautiful day, so I'm sure people have left gardening plants wilted and all sorts of other events on hold, but I very much appreciate it. I'd like to thank Anne, wherever she is, Anne Coffin. She's still working in the back, for arranging this a while ago. I mean, these things take a lot of time, as you might imagine. And Margaret, who just gave the introduction, all these things behind the scenes, and very much appreciated. I can't think of a better place to do a talk about the revolution. There's a lot of history right here in Cornwall and the Litchfield area. So that's exciting. I thought what I would do is give a brief introduction and then go through some of the images from the book. It's a combination of paintings and writing that I did for this. And then I will read one passage from one of the essays, 30 essays in total, corresponding with about 30 images from 30 historical sites. And then I'd be glad to take any questions, if anyone would like. And I will sign some books. There are some left. Some people got me early, and I signed it for them. This book is, in some sense, a sequel to a book that I did previously, or a couple of books before, that I gave a talk here on, The Homes of American Presidents, which I worked on actually with the historian David McCullough. And that whet my appetite to delve further into the colonial era. Some of these homes that I did for the presidents were from that revolutionary period, certainly Jefferson, Madison, Washington's house. And I thought I would expand on this and take it further. I initially felt, what did I get myself into? The American Revolution is a huge topic. People devote their entire lives, historians especially. The book on the presidents, I did have the benefit of working with David McCullough, who's won about 7 Pulitzer Prizes. But at the same time, those were individual houses easier to get a handle on. This was a large topic, and is a large topic. So I basically gave myself a year to just research beyond what my high school knowledge and brief college courses on it were. But one of the things that gave a sense that I could do this was the history of the revolution, and history itself isn't always about battles and soldiers dying and generals and kings and queens if you're in Europe, or presidents. It's also about art and culture. And when I could, I tried to interweave that in the book. I felt like I do have some knowledge of that, being an artist and teacher. And when I could, as I say, it's not easy because the revolution is full of battles and generals, but there are opportunities to talk about people like Gilbert Stuart, whose portraits of so many of the founding fathers are part of that history as well. And some statuary, when I had a chance to highlight some of the sculptors who did some of the famous monuments to the revolution, I highlighted those as well. I would say that there's really no substitute for visiting these sites. It may sound obvious, the same way I guess if you saw a picture or a painting on Google Images and then went to a museum, it's a very different experience. But going to these sites and places like Cliveden, if you know Cliveden Manor, which is somewhere around here, I think it's in the other room, and standing on the threshold, it was not a huge battle, but a really disastrous battle for the Patriots. And many of them lay dying right at the front steps of that stone structure outside of Philadelphia, in a constant back and forth to take that city over the course of several years. And you stand on those steps and you never forget that feeling, or entering the door where in some cases you can still see musket holes. If you go to certainly the great mansions of the founding fathers, Jefferson's or Adams' house, and hold the same banister that they did, that's thrilling. And it's not always the case. Sometimes things are replicas, right, in museums. And I would give another example. You can also get the feeling of banging your head if you're 6'1" like I am on some of these low colonial buildings, such as one I think of in particular, where I still remember hitting my head in Staten Island, the Phillip House, where, if some of you know that, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Edward Rutledge met General Howe shortly after shortly after the Declaration of Independence was signed. Howe offered them an olive branch to just forget the whole thing and pretend that this never happened. But Franklin and Adams were adamant that they were going to continue for the cause. So that's another house or a site that's worth visiting. I interviewed people when I went to these sites. I spoke to the park rangers when I went to a national park. I spoke to scholars. I wanted to feel like I didn't want to just do another Wikipedia entry to combine with my paintings, which presumably were fresh, but I wanted the stories to be fresh too. So that was invigorating, and I included those in here to be a little highfalutin. I was trying to model it after a Talk of the Town piece, where they interview, in the New Yorker, where they interview people and kind of integrate that into a short essay. That was my model. I would say at times I did not let the Founding Fathers get a free pass on their less savory aspects. Certainly slavery appears in topics throughout the book. And they also had ulterior motives to win the war. George Washington was already thinking about speculating for land development further west in Ohio if he succeeded. There were others. I also had to take a step back too, because that's not the kind of book this is. There have been other books on that. I published and I talked about that. So when I could, I did. But I also did that minimally. I would say my last comment would be that it's very interesting to see in the case of New York, where I live, how many sites there are still extant in the city, and if not extant, that you learn and understand how much of the war was fought in terms of politics and actual battles right in Manhattan or just around it. But you can, the Morris Jumel Mansion, if you know that, on what's known as Coogan's Bluff, the oldest house in Manhattan. Washington had headquarters for several months. You have the location where he read the Declaration of Independence to his soldiers in front of City Hall. There's a marker for that. You have Francis's Tavern, where Washington gave his farewell to his officers. It's a replica of the building, but it's so well done. If Washington came back, I don't think he could tell the difference. The building was actually built in 1900 after the original burned down. You have, of course, the Battle of White Plains, the Battle of Harlem Heights up near Columbia. There's a wonderful plaque on one of the Columbia buildings. And if you think about it, some people don't realize that George Washington lived in Manhattan for 2 years when he was president. That was the capital. And he worshipped at St. Paul's Chapel, which is very much there. There was Washington's Pew for a long time, which you could visit. I don't think it's there now. He actually went to the first commencement of Columbia College. It was then, before that, King's College, and changed after the war to Columbia. I think there were probably only 20 students in the graduating class. In those days, the universities were quite small. But let me go to the slides and take you through some of the places and the paintings I did at them. This is, of course, the cover. If you haven't seen the book, there it is. I won't dwell on this too much, it's too hard to see, but I did include a map in the back of the book showing the various places that I went to. But as you can imagine, most of them, if not all of them, are right on the seaboard where the development of the colonies took place. This is Colonial Williamsburg, which is a place worth visiting if you went there as a child, which many people do. I went there as a child, I went there later with my children. But it's by no means a Disneyland. I mean, what always struck me when I went there is the actors who take in character these incredible figures from the Revolution, whether it's Patrick Henry or Jefferson. They're incredibly knowledgeable. They take their job tremendously seriously, and they don't see a little kid and say, oh my goodness, you want an ice cream? They stay in character, you learn from them, whatever age you are. The Rockefellers put in the equivalent of billions of dollars to make this the place that it is. So I highly recommend that if you have not been recently. This is a map. I should say half the 30 sites or so that I did, but half of them are a little more well-known than others. The other half are, I hope, newer to people who aren't more familiar with the Revolution. This is a map showing, and a chapter I did about Benedict Arnold, who was Washington's favorite general, believe it or not, for those who are not aware, before he defected. And before the Declaration of Independence was signed, he was already leading a group of over 1,000 men who started out in Cambridge, where Washington had his headquarters, up through into Canada, through Maine, to attack a British fort. And the ordeal was that they didn't really know the terrain that well. It was very wooded, very rough ravines and whatnot. And over half of them died. They were eating their dogs and all sorts of things by the end of it. And when they got to the British garrison in that fort, they were whipped, as you say, and it was already winter, so it was a disaster, really. But Benedict Arnold is stuck it through the whole time, and it's one of his, believe it or not, great contributions to the Revolution, even though he failed to win the battle. This is, of course, I'm sure you recognize, it's right over there, a statue of Paul Revere in Boston. Revere is actually interesting when I delved into him. He was not that well known a few decades after he died. You think that's hard to believe. He would have been known as a silversmith. There were other riders who ran that night and said that the redcoats are coming. What really brought his fame to this time is the famous poem of Longfellow. So it helps to have your name rhyme with another word for how a poet write about you. This is Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, tucked right behind Independence Hall. It's an absolute architectural gem. A lot of people miss it when they go to Philadelphia. It's where the first Continental Congress met on their first meetings. They met on the ground floor. They closed the shutters because the British had soldiers that were usually walking around. But it's not only an architectural masterpiece, but a very historic building. That's well worth it if you go to Independence Hall. I should say one thing that reminds me, you know, one of the stories that keeps coming up again and again as anyone who studies this period, and certainly me, you question, you know, why these men pledged their lives, these founding fathers, so many of them who were incredibly wealthy people, who had lives ahead of them, had large families. In the case, the average age was 43 of the signers. Thomas Jefferson was only 33. He had over 10,000 acres. And the odds were so much against them. You know, what propelled them, especially because they financially wouldn't have been that affected by things like the Stamp Act, which was an extra charge for documents. So I explore that in the book. I don't want to give away too much because you hope to read the book. But it's questions that you know, you ponder. Certainly Washington was very wealthy himself. And these were young men, had a life ahead of them. This is, I interspersed some of these imagery from buildings and statuary to also figures, in this case, the Battle of Brooklyn, which was the largest battle of the Revolution. Not really emphasized, at least in my time, in the textbooks, maybe because it was a disastrous defeat. Also known as the Battle of Long Island. There were over 30,000 men engaged between the two sides, which was huge compared to most of the battles of the Revolution, which sometimes had only 1,000 men per side. But if you do know this story, and there's a building in, which I mentioned in Brooklyn, which commemorates this, Howe had the Washington on the ropes after that first day of really destroying the Continental Army. They all had their camps, they licked their wounds that night, and presumably Howe thought it was over. It was the first major battle. They had won handily. What he didn't realize is the resolve of Washington, because at that evening, Washington decided he wanted to have his men fight another day. So miraculously, it was known as the Dunkirk of the American Revolution. How he did it, we'll never really know, but he had an officer who gathered up rowboats on the Brooklyn side of all the local farmers, and they snuck across the East River to Manhattan just before dawn, when a fog came up, supposedly, that blocked the view from the British, and they did live to fight another day. This is the Phillip House I mentioned briefly, when Adams and Franklin and Rutledge met General Howe. You can visit this house, as all these structures you can visit, or places that I mentioned. And it's a very sleepy place, all the way at the end of Staten Island. I don't even think mass transportation gets you there, but it's a piece of history that's worth seeing. This is, of course, Independence Hall. I did 2 images for this book. One right there, which is used for the cover, and for the inside, I wanted to do a different version, so it'd be different from the cover. And we all know what happens there. Here's that other image. And for the artists in the room, this was an opportunity to, in some of my watercolors, not to necessarily use white paper, but to use off-white paper and apply gouache to create the highlights. It's a very old technique that I'm sure you know is used in oils. Less common in watercolor today, but I've enjoyed doing it over the years, and I teach my students at Yale the same thing. This is Nassau Hall in Princeton. It was once the largest building in the colonies, and this was one of the main sites of the Battle of Princeton. Not a huge battle, almost a skirmish, but the Americans did win this, and it was pivotal in those early days. But what's interesting is the British set up garrison in that building, and the walls must be 3 feet thick. They still are. So it was very hard to penetrate any of that with the artillery. The one exception being so-called this legend that Alexander Hamilton, who had his own artillery with Washington's army, shot a cannonball through one of the windows, and it hit a portrait of George III, and then presumably fell down on the ground. That's in a lot of books, so I'm assuming it's true. This is John Adams' house in Quincy, Massachusetts, at the time known as Braintree. What's interesting about this place, the grounds are not what they were, probably 300 or 400 acres at one time. He was not as wealthy as Jefferson in Washington, but he had a sizable farm, but now it's only 3 or 4 acres. But the house itself has so many original artifacts of Adams's time, partly because the family continued in several generations to live in that home and keep everything just as it was. So there are many famous descendants of John and Abigail, Charles Francis Adams, the writer Henry Adams, and they were great custodians, even built a library in the back after John and Abigail died, where a lot of the papers are stored. Again, an opportunity to show figures and bring it to life. This is detailing a heroic journey that General Knox of the Patriots took on to take abandoned cannons in Fort Ticonderoga to bring to Boston, where the British were set up with their ships, and it took 6 weeks, which would have taken 24 hours with North American van lines. But back then, of course, they didn't have that luxury, and they disassembled the cannons on the wheels. As you see, this is supposedly based on what we know of the accounts. But when they set up their cannons on Dorchester Heights and the British saw these, where did they get these things out of nowhere? They gave up right there, because you can't shoot up with cannonballs, but they had them as sitting ducks. But Knox will always be known for this epic journey. This is Clifton, I mentioned earlier, where there was a battle, and I mentioned those front steps which you can stand on, where people literally died right there. This is, as you might surmise, Valley Forge, one of the cabins there. I'm going to read a little excerpt from that, so I don't want to go too much into it, but I'm sure you know somewhat of it. This is interesting. I did, because I wanted everything to be my work in the book, I actually did a other drawing in this case. I will mention that this is a British spy named Major John Andre. How many of you, does that ring a bell for some? Yes. Incredible story. He was conspiring with Benedict Arnold before Washington and the rest of the army and the Americans knew that Arnold was defecting. And Andre was a very glamorous figure in Britain. He was a relatively young man, 29, 30, I guess, an artist, well-liked, handsome, but he took on this conspiratorial role and was caught in Tappan, New York. I think it's now considered Rockland County, by 3 militiamen who were out patrolling, and they noticed him, they checked him out, they did the equivalent of frisking him, and then one of them said, "Oh, let him go, he's got nothing." And then one of them said, "Hey, wait a minute, check his boots." I don't know if I would have thought of that. But in his boots were very detailed plans of West Point, which was at that time a strategic fort. It wasn't a military academy. Arnold had given Andre these plans, and Andre was going to give them to his officers. Well, Washington found out about this, and he was considered a spy for doing this, and he was set to be executed, which he was. On the day of his execution, though, Andre did a drawing of himself in pen and ink, which this is. To say, "I've done a drawing of a drawing." That's quite accurate if you look at the original. Now, how he had the stomach for this, I'll never know. I don't think anyone will ever know. But the miraculous thing is, I went to the Yale Art Museum, and they have that sketch. You can go yourself, if you're affiliated with Yale or not. You can ask them, it's a public museum, and they will bring it out for you. Give them a day or so notice. It's a little drawing, it's got one fold over. Maybe he gave it to a guard on the way to the execution. We'll never know. But to hold that in your hands is extraordinary. And I guess the story is that we stood on the, oh, well, I'll give you one last morbid detail. He requested of Washington that he be shot by a firing squad because a soldier dies honorably with a firing squad, not be hanged by a tree, hung, whatever. But Washington said no. Nathan Hale had hung from a tree, so that was the fate. This is another kind of unusual historical site, again actually referencing West Point. This is at West Point. It's a monument to the last remaining links of a chain that were used to create what is known as the Great Chain that was laid across the Hudson by the Americans so that the British would not be able to go freely with their ships. Anyone who controlled the Hudson really controlled the topography of the Revolutionary War. And again, if you had a normal forge, if that's even what it would be called today, they would churn out this chain in a week. But this took months. They didn't have major forges. They had local blacksmith shops. But they pulled this off, and it was critical for stopping the British Navy. This is a printing press at an existing print shop in Philadelphia of Benjamin Franklin's. We don't have the luxury of Benjamin Franklin's house because it was long demolished. A very colorful man, of course, interesting and wonderful in so many respects, but we don't have that. But we do have the printing press that he made or bought the space for, and you can see the old style printing going on if you visit that in Philly. This is a statue to Thomas Paine in New Rochelle, New York, of all places, because the Americans gave him a farm of some 300 acres after the war to thank him for his service. His book, or short book, Common Sense, is probably one of the greatest publishing stories in the history of America. There were supposedly 350,000 copies sold, and when you think about how many, the population of America, it's extraordinary. And he, in his book, if some of you have actually read it, maybe in high school, maybe not, but it's worth reading again, he reached the masses like no one else. He wasn't saying anything original, his ideas were not new, but he said it in such a way with his language, and that resonated with a common man, a common woman. And He didn't reference Aristotle or Locke as Jefferson or Adams might have, but he had these wonderful metaphors that I'm sure some of you know, and references that were poetic and really gathered the larger population for the cause. This is a scene in the southern swamps of Georgia and South Carolina, where a lot of the war was fought. That was kind of a revelation to me. Per number, there's arguments that more battles actually took place in the South than the North. Maybe not as famous, perhaps. But essentially, the British, after the first half of the war, were in a stalemate. They had New York City, which occupied the entire 8 years, but they were gaining and losing Philadelphia. They had trouble gaining traction because of the Hudson River, and so they decided to go south, where they thought they had loyalist leanings, and they could take the Americans there. Well, I didn't realize there was another version of George Washington, very slippery fellow who played on defense, if you will, named Francis Marion, who was a cult hero in the South for a long time. I don't know if he's still a member. But he and his band of Robin Hood kind of marauders, guerrilla warfare, if you will, sort of terrorists, they hid in these swamps, which the British had no idea how to navigate. Probably most Americans wouldn't have. And they would come out and make these piecemeal attacks and throw off the British and win several advantages because the British never knew when they were going to come. And he had enough name recognition into the 1960s that Walt Disney did a miniseries, live action, of Francis Marion. I don't think he's known as well today. This is, as you might suspect, George Washington's house, Mount Vernon. I did a larger treatise on this, if you will, in my book prior to this. So I chose instead to focus on the gardens. Washington really thought of himself as a planter. That was the greatest status he could think of himself as, probably more than as a president. Perhaps Jefferson felt the same way. There is a quality of these founding fathers, whether it was manufactured or not, but a certain sense of humility that's quite striking. When I say that, he would have been preferred to be known as a planter than a president. I think part of that is really true. And Jefferson, who wrote his own epitaph, he was very a control freak, as they say. He did not include that he had been president of the United States. He wanted to be known as the author of Notes of Virginia, the designer of the University of Virginia, and I think one other thing, the signer of the writer of the Declaration of Independence. This is St. Paul Chapel in New York, which I alluded to. Sits among all these skyscrapers, but Washington worshipped here for those 2 years he was living there. This is a man, statue to whom is in Washington, D.C., Lafayette, who deserves to be a founding father, if there ever was one. He was so passionate for the cause and came over and helped create the alliance that effectively allowed the Americans to win, because without the French they couldn't have. They bought all the money and extra soldiery. And you could argue the French joined against the Americans because they so despised the British. Presumably that's the case. Lafayette is different. He really believed in this idea of freedom, became a very close friend of George Washington. Some armchair psychologists might say that this was the son he never had. They were deeply devoted to each other. He was a much younger man, well, much younger in those days, I guess 25 years younger. And Lafayette was also engaged in several battles, Battle of Brandywine and Yorktown. But what's also extraordinary to show how he was so beloved by the Americans, 50 years after the Revolution, he came back from France. And he was given a victory tour that really rivals Beatlemania. I mean, for 2 years, it started out to be, I think, a few months, it turned into 2 years. He went to every state. There were celebrations, fireworks, souvenir plates made, everything you could imagine. And he was so beloved. And there was a lot of counties and streets in Manhattan named Lafayette Street. This is a house that Jefferson built. You might think it was Monticello, but in fact he built a smaller mini version of this in Poplar Forest, an estate that he owned also in Virginia. The reason why he built it, in part, it helped to have his father-in-law's property that he inherited. But he built another house because he had become such a celebrity after the revolution and presumably during his presidency that people used to just walk up to his house in Charlottesville, knock on the French doors and say, "Hey Joe, come out for an autograph." So he had to escape that, and this was his getaway. Very beautiful structure, but very similar to Monticello. This is the Webb House in Wethersfield, not far from here, outside of Hartford, in a beautifully pristine little enclave of colonial homes. This is where a very historic meeting took place of General Washington and Rochambeau, the general from France that King Louis the, XVI sent over so that they could create this alliance. That bond between these two generals is quite extraordinary. They planned Yorktown there, and Rochambeau did not speak a word of English. He had to write notes or had a translator. But these two men sort of sorted out their differences in a common cause. Rochambeau had 12 last names, being a very established aristocrat. Washington had none of that. Rochambeau could have easily said, "Who the hell am I listening to this guy?" But he was instructed to be deference to Washington and vice versa. Washington respected Rochambeau, although he was not from America. And the two of them sorted it out. I'm simplifying it, obviously, but they had several meetings, but this is probably one of the most crucial. Washington was determined to get back New York City. It was a thorn in his side that he had lost it, and he kept pursuing that. It was, I guess you might argue, an emotional decision. Rochambeau convinced him that it was not a good idea. He had an objective viewpoint on this. He hadn't lost the Battle of Brooklyn. He said, "You will never get back New York. Give it up." And Washington, I guess, again, paraphrasing it, I'm sure there were a lot of heated discussions, but he eventually agreed that Yorktown is the culmination of that. This is Rochambeau himself in Newport. There's a beautiful statue to him looking out over the bay, and you can see that if you head out to see the rest of Newport, which is a beautiful city. This is the battle site at Yorktown, looking a little bit more picturesque than I'm sure the Americans and the British would have remembered it. It was actually a siege, not a battle, but they had Cornwallis cornered on the Chesapeake, and he had to surrender. He went on and on, apparently at the final days of the battle when he had to surrender, that he didn't want to use the word surrender in the surrender, and they came up with some compromise. This is, I think, the last image. This is the Maryland State House in Annapolis, Maryland, where George Washington resigned his commission as general right after the war. And you think, what is the big deal here? It's a bunch of paperwork, which it essentially was. And in a sense, it's about as sexy as renewing your driver's license. But the implications of that to a man who was really considered a deity by the end of that war. And believe it or not, members of the new republic wanted to be president. I'm sorry, king. Hardest that is to fathom. But he chose, like Cincinnatus, to leave it all and head to his farm and call it quits, which he did. Of course, he came back later when he was named president. So, if I may, I will indulge you now. I showed you the images and read one excerpt from one of the essays, and then, as I said, I'll be glad to answer some questions. This is about Valley Forge. Kind of a strange compliment to a beautiful day like this, but maybe that'll be interesting. Called Winter of Discontent. If you Google George Washington at Valley Forge, chances are you'll come across a picture by Arnold Freeburg, painted in 1975. It shows Washington kneeling alone in the snow, his hands clasped in prayer. Washington was a deeply religious man, and it's possible he did in fact pray. He certainly had reason to. Some 2,000 of his men had died that winter in early spring of 1777 to 78, many from disease or starvation, in what became a horrific 6 months. On February 16, 1778, in the midst of the crisis, the general wrote to Governor Clinton of New York, "For some days past, there has been little less than a famine in camp. A part of the army has been a week without any kind of flesh and rest for 3 or 4 days. Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery." Washington pleaded with Congress for more supplies, but received little for his pains. Congress was hampered by scarcity of money, failure of credit, and an inefficient administrative system mired in bureaucratic wrangling. Meanwhile, Washington's army was reeling from a string of defeats in Pennsylvania during that spring of 1777 at Paoli, Brandywine, and Germantown. Each had been an attempt to win back Philadelphia. Washington could no longer afford to wait for Congress to act. He tried instead to purchase food from the locals around Valley Forge, but met with resistance. Farmers would rather sell to the English, whose currency was more valuable. Furthermore, some of these farmers were reluctant because of their own loyalist leanings. Why support a fight against people who had the same language, religion, and customs? Pennsylvania, like New York and most of the South, had a sizable population that sided with the Crown. In desperation, Washington was forced to confiscate food supplies from the neighboring residents, something he felt morally opposed to. Given these hardships at Valley Forge, then, how did the Continental Army stay together, and how did the men continue to fight? In the fall of 2019, I set out to find some answers. Traveling by car, I headed out of New York City toward Valley Forge National Park. The address on my navigation system read 1400 North Outer Line Drive, King of Prussia, PA. I took I-95 south through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. For much of the drive, the only scenery seemed to be numbing stretches of smokestacks and oil storage tanks. The interstate was bumper to bumper. Fumes were sickening. When I finally got near the park, I was confronted with shopping malls and high-rise developments. This wasn't what I expected for my scenic tour. Things changed, however, as soon as I passed through the gates of Valley Forge. White lines and exit ramps gave way to the beauty of open fields, mature trees, and stone walls. Wooden fence posts lined the narrow, curving roads. I arrived at the visitor center and made a beeline for the reception desk. I was told to contact Park Ranger Bill Trotman, who had been assigned to give me a private tour at 3 o'clock. The office assistant wrote down his cell number for me, and I called him. "I'm running a bit late," Bill said. "I was just firing muskets near one of the cabins." Perfect, I thought. I'm in the right place. After a short wait in the gift shop, I spotted a figure in the shop who had just arrived, dressed in a brown and green uniform. It was Bill, a big man with thick white hair, broad shoulders, and a husky voice. He reminded me of a football coach. "Sorry to keep you," he said. "I was changing out of my soldier's clothes. I was doing a reenactment for a school group. Let's hop in my car." It was a late November afternoon, but Bill assured me we would get in as much of the tour as possible before evening set in. We climbed into his white SUV just as it began to drizzle and wove through the park's serpentine byways. "This area was originally established by Quakers in the 1740s, he told me. They founded the Mountjoy Forge here and formed a small industrial community. Over time, they expanded the ironworks and built mills and houses. The surrounding acreage was rich farmland for growing wheat, Indian corn, hay, and rye. Washington's quartermaster, Thomas Mifflin, scouted this area near the Schuylkill River and decided it was a good place to camp because it was secluded between 2 hills. Our first stop was a row of log cabins. These were built by the soldiers themselves, Bill said, on Washington's orders. There was prize money for the best ones. Construction began immediately upon arrival at the camp on December 19, 1777, because the troops had no barracks to sleep in, and winter had set in. The men had grown up on farms in New England, so they knew how to build things. They made the chimneys out of wood because it was too labor-intensive to make stone ones. Originally, there were hundreds of these cabins in long rows. "We have 10 replicas," said Bill, on display. We entered one of the cabins. A fire was crackling in the hearth. I eyed the bunk beds and the dirt floor. The room was dark and damp. The exposed walls were caked with mud and straw to keep out the draught. There were no windows. Poor air circulation, I learned, led to stuffy, often foul-smelling spaces that were ripe for spreading disease. You can imagine how many trees were cut down for these cabins, Bill said. They were built to house some 11,000 soldiers. There were about 12 men per cabin, each cabin about 14 by 16. They also needed wood to keep the bake ovens running. There were thousands of loaves of bread every day needed to feed the soldier. He spoke passionately about the history of Valley Forge. The rebel army had been in dire need of basic necessities like blankets, he said, and the desertion rate was close to 20%. He talked about the meager rations, often just watery soup made from bone marrow. Sometimes the men boiled fat. I hope your dinner will be better than that. In 2019, Bill had been working at Valley Forge for over 27 years. I was a high school teacher for 10 years before that, he said. It takes a lot of training to be a ranger. The National Parks requires us, in addition to our history education, to be peace officers. That means instruction on using firearms, driving emergency vehicles, and arrest techniques. In between my hours here, though, I'm writing a book on Benjamin Franklin. Just a couple chapters left. Back in the car, we continued on our tour. Our next stop was George Washington's headquarters, a fieldstone building with white trim, characteristic of the Delaware Valley. Bill pointed out the flag in front, a replica. It had 13 stars, one for each of the colonies. This was one of the first flags of the new republic, he said. In front of this house, there would have been Washington's elite guards, he said, assigned to protect him. There were about 50 of them, kind of like the Secret Service today. You needed a password before they let you in. Our final destination was a bronze statue, this one of a man in a long cloak and hat standing atop a stone pedestal. Baron van Steuben, Bill said. He was an unsung hero of the Revolution. He was a former officer in the Prussian War. Some question whether he was an actual baron. Regardless, he said, he had a lot of experience in military maneuvers and drills and had written a manual on the subject. He was hired to teach the ragtag troops how to get in shape. By the time the Americans left Valley Forge for good, in June 1778, the soldiers had been transformed into a disciplined army, he told me. Come back again December 19th, Bill said. That's when we do a reenactment of the army entering the camp on the same day in 1777. I dress up sometimes, but not every year. I'm getting a bit old for this kind of stuff. I know my time is coming because a third grader came up to me the other day and asked if I've ever met George Washington. Can you believe it? I said no, but I did know Thomas Jefferson. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think there's a little bit of time. If anyone would like to ask a question, don't be intimidated. I didn't know anything about American history until I did this book.
I have a question. I'd never heard about the chain link across the Hudson. Did it persist? Did they figure out ultimately how to break it? Was it there for the whole war?
It did actually work. They had done earlier versions. I should mention the engineer was a man named Thomas Machen or Machen, I'm not sure, a genius. Washington, I guess, came in touch with him. And the first attempts didn't work so well. I think the British did get around it or broke it. But the last version they got right, and it really did inhibit the British from, because the British could go up and down the Hudson because it was wide enough that if you go in the center, the cannonballs from the side that the Americans had would just miss it. The artillery hadn't advanced enough to send cannonballs that far. So they'd go willy-nilly up and down the center, and they had to come up with this solution.
Thanks. By the way, I should have started by saying that was spectacular. Really,
thank you very much.
Really special. Thank you.
Any other questions? There's one back there.
Adam, what was the most surprising thing you learned in your research?
Well, maybe I gave it away in my comments, but I didn't realize the extent that the war was fought in the South. I don't think, maybe I was asleep at the wheel in high school, but I don't remember that being something that was emphasized. It'd be one thing if it's a couple of battles. A good half of the war, General Washington gave the so-called Southern Campaign to a man, one of his officers, Nathaniel Greene. I mention him in this book. You can visit his house. He's not famous like some of the others, but he held the Continental Army enough together. I mentioned Francis Marion, but that was a smaller group. Nathaniel Greene was in charge of a larger army, and they succeeded at various battles, losing many of them, but wearing the British down. When you look back at some of these, I'm drawing a blank on some of the names. Of course, the one in Virginia, Yorktown, was the ultimate.
The Battle of Guilford Courthouse.
That's Guilford Courthouse, very good, thank you. And the several others. So in the Battle of Savannah, the Battle of Charleston, these were also attempts to win major cities, and sometimes successful, sometimes they lost them, sometimes they got them back. But it was critical, and I think that's what the British finally said, this is hopeless. We tried them in the north, we tried them in the south. Of course, they lose at Yorktown. The war continued for another year or so after Yorktown. That's considered, a major turning point, but the war still lingered on. It's interesting, probably the greatest turning point was the Battle of Saratoga, which you can visit that site not far from here in New York's upstate. That's when the French decided they were going to really supply the Americans with everything they needed. In the beginning, they were hedging their bets. I mean, who's going to win this, the British or the Americans? Do we want to invest in this if they get demolished by the British? But when they saw at Saratoga that the Americans won a sound defeat, they thought, these men are for real. They can win this. They poured everything into it. Interestingly, also, it's kind of a morality tale about what happens in history. The British officer in charge of that battle, who was soundly defeated, was John Burgoyne, known as Gentleman Johnny. He was very popular in England, had been successful as an officer there. He came to kind of mop things up, and he failed, so much so that he was persona non grata to the British after that, for the rest of his life, for having failed to win that. He is known to some who like art history for a gorgeous portrait done by Sir Joshua Reynolds of him in his full regalia, and he will always be known for that if you're sympathetic to him. But he was buried in Westminster Abbey in a cloister, not the main nave, and they didn't even mark the tablet on the floor. It was blank until 1963. Somebody, I don't remember the full story, had his name carved with his dates. But that goes to show, you can be at the top and then they knock you down, or you knock yourself down. He was quite arrogant, if you want to look at it, and was not prepared. I guess nobody thought the Americans could win at Saratoga, so kind of another surprise. Well, Benedict Arnold being a great general was a surprise. I didn't realize that. But, yeah, go ahead.
The picture of the links, or the circular picture of the links, do you know whether that was the first iteration of the chain, or was that a later one? That was considered
the most successful so-called Great Chain. So they have those 12 or so links from that last version.
Do you know how big they were?
Well, yes, I would say they each wore 100 pounds. These
so
links.
They used to have one in the 60s outside the, it used to be the old Lake Hill Journal building.
Oh, really?
But it's sort of a big, tall, very tall brick building next to where the old firehouse was. And that used to be the Lake Hill Journal. And they had this link out there with a little legend on it. And it was about that big. It was about this thick.
Yeah.
And they said that one of the, and because there was a lot of iron
in this area. Surely.
But the transportation to the Hudson was very difficult. And also they had to transport it linked.
Well, this is actually, yes, I mean, I remember some of this, but it's very interesting.
Carts and
Yes.
things, and everybody had links, and then they said that they had put boats across with one link in each boat and 4 or 5 men, and they practiced. And the idea was you'd go 1, 2, 3, and they lift it up, and it was very important that they all got them out at the same time.
Oh, this is great stuff.
And that was...
I should have interviewed you for this. No, it is again, remarkable because everything was so primitive. The technology, they had to do things like this. I guess an ultimate example is the Brooklyn Bridge when that was done. Again, monumental, not so much today. But certainly on even a smaller scale, that was extraordinary. Thank you. Are there any other questions? One in the back?
Yeah, I have a question about the paintings, which are very beautiful. Did you go to the sites and paint them there? Did you take photos? And then
Yes, I mean, most of the time, and how I mostly work is en plein air, if you will, outdoors. So I set aside time to do that. I do that in many of my books and my own work. I don't always finish them. Sometimes the unfinished ones, I come home and say, hey, this isn't bad. I've caught the moment, I don't need to fuss with it. So I leave them slightly unfinished. Some I do feel I need to come back and do things too. But I try to capture that moment there at these places. It usually takes me 2 or 3 hours, sometimes more. Eventually your butt starts to hurt on the little stool that I've set up and you call it quits, or, you know, the weather changes or the park closes, so it's not always going according to plan. But I go in with that concept, so I hope it has that moment of immediacy, which watercolor can do. You can't really do that with oils and pack up, you know. It's a great medium, but it doesn't do as well for outdoor quick painting. This question? Fred Peters, okay.
When did the Americans get New York back?
Good question. I feel like I planted you because I hadn't thought to bring that up. It went all the way to the end. And they celebrated Evacuation Day, so-called, when they shoved the British out at the very end of the war. It was celebrated all the way in America until World War I, when the American Congress thought it wasn't such a good idea to celebrate Evacuation Day when they're an ally for us in World War I. But they had it the entire time. I mean, give or take a few days, you know, but essentially, and that's why Washington could never quite get it out of his mind. Any question? No. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you. I think there are a few books left. If you'd like, I can go over there and you can ask me further questions, or I can sign some.